you wouldn't get this conversation on CNN or Fox, either one. The conversation we're having where I'm saying, you need to listen to what he has to say before you make up your mind.
We find that I have a big conversion rate when people actually listen to me.
As we enter the heart of the 2024 presidential race, RFK Jr. aims to do what no third-party candidate has ever done: win the presidency. Will we have another Kennedy in the White House, or will he tip the scales towards either former President Trump or President Biden? This is a pivotal moment in American politics, reminiscent of those rare occasions when a third-party candidate shook up the status quo. Just a few weeks ago, I sat down with President Donald Trump, and tonight I'll dive into where RFK Jr. stands in one of the highest stakes elections of our lifetime. With RFK Jr. polling around 10% nationally and people's disenchantment with both Trump and Biden, could he be the wild card no one saw coming? How do you like to be addressed?
Robert,
Great.
I watched your show with President Trump. It was really good. The best I've ever seen him presenting himself. I think you brought out the best in him.
That was my plan. Robert, I'm very proud to sit down with you, by the way. And I do try to be a different kind of interviewer. I'm not a politician. I don't know squat about politics, nor do I desire to. I'm certainly not some kind of gotcha interviewer. Being from a psychological background and dealing with psychosocial issues, I try to go at these things from a different standpoint. And you can probably predict my first question, which will be very, very predictable. I hope your answer is not. I've spent a lot of my time professionally. I was in the litigation arena, which I know you've got great expertise in. I spent a lot of time preparing CEOs of Fortune 100 companies to testify. And I know about having their 4 talking points and pivoting back to those. And I know how politicians go about it. I know you have things that you cover when you're on the campaign trail. And I hope, like I did with President Trump, for people to get to know a side of you that maybe they don't get to see every day. You're in a run for the President of the United States. And my first question is why? Certainly from a third-party perspective, the odds have got to be long. So why are you doing it?
It wasn't something that I was sitting around thinking, I got to do this someday. I have a really good life. I have an amazing family, and I have a job where I'm very effective and where I was having fun at and making a good living. But I saw something happening to my country that I couldn't really imagine. I saw this huge division that's so toxic now, so poisonous. When I lived through the 1960s, when my father ran for president at a time of great division, but I don't think we've seen anything like this since the American Civil War. And it's all amplified by the social media algorithms that are pushing us farther and farther into our positions, into these kind of tribal positions. But the origin of it is I believe, the capture of our political parties by corporate interests and the corruption that's come from that. And the political parties are fueling that fire. I think this presidential campaign will cost about $15 billion. And that money is coming from these big corporations and this new kind of oligarchy of billionaires. And when they donate the money, they expect something in return. And it's transformed the political parties away from democracy. Their function is to advance the mercantile interests of the corporations that are funding them. And
is that true on both sides, Democrat and Republican?
Yeah, and a lot of times it's the same company as BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the defense contractors, an oil company and a coal company and a tobacco company, and the arms companies are more likely to give to the Republican Party. And then, there's a whole slew of the pharmaceutical companies are more likely to give to the Democrats. But they're both owned by, interests that are not necessarily America's interests. And I felt I was in a unique position to talk about this because I've spent my entire career, 40 years, suing agencies and large polluters and the agencies that they've now captured. I've sued almost all of them. I've sued EPA as much as any other attorney. I've sued CDC, NIH, FDA, the public health agencies, the FCC, the USDA. And when you do this litigation, you get a PhD in corporate capture and how to unravel it. I also felt like I had a clarity of vision about what this country is supposed to look like. And I feel like I'm in a unique position to see how far it departed from those values.
Historically, third-party candidates are not successful. So are you the exception? And if not, what's the end game? What's your ultimate goal? Can you win?
I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I could win. We're in a unique time in American history now where we have the two least popular candidates running. We have between 70 and 80% of the American public saying they don't want that choice, that they want a different choice. I'm in a position, no independent candidate has been in history. All the polls that have shown me in a two-way race against President Trump show me beating him. All the polls that show me in a two-way race against President Biden show me beating him in a landslide. And, the Zogby poll is the biggest poll taken, and it shows me beating President Biden in a head-to-head race, winning 39 states and him only winning 11. I beat President Trump on a very, very narrow margin, but President Biden can't beat him. And there's never been an independent candidate who's been in that strong a position before.
Let me ask you this, and then I want to get on to some of the policies, because there's a lot of things you and I agree about, actually, and I look at it from the cultural standpoint. I think perception is reality. If people believe something to be true to them, that's reality. And I know that to be true psychologically. You have a lot of theories that are non-consensual. Would you agree with that? They're not widely held theories?
The way I would put it is that I'm willing to depart from orthodoxies if I don't believe the evidence supports those orthodoxies.
I don't want to go into them because you've talked about them a lot of places, and I'm happy to put links up to every quality place that you've talked about them that you would like me to, but you've talked about vaccines, Wi-Fi waves that cross the blood barrier of the brain and break down the mitochondria of the cells, massive increase in school shootings subsequent to pharmas pushing antidepressants like Prozac, chemicals in the water contributing to sexual dysphoria, I assume you mean gender dysphoria in kids, primarily boys, that the election in 2004 was basically stolen, that Bill Gates' 5G networks constitute a mass surveillance system. They're not consensual. They're not widely held. I don't want to go into them now. Like vaccines, for example, you had a great conversation with my good friend Joe Rogan about that, and I'll put that link up so people can listen to it if they want to. Do you have a perception problem? People hear it people hear it and say, that's crazy conspiracy theory, but they don't really listen to what you have to say.
Yeah, you kind of put me in a bad position to rattle off a bunch of things I've supposedly said without giving the basis for, what I was saying. And let me just give you an example. The connection between atrazine, which is a chemical that is in about 63% of America's water supply, that there has been an increase in gender dysphoria in this country, and that we should be looking at reasons for that. There's been a series of studies, including one by a very famous scientist called Tyler Hayes at the University of Berkeley, published in the National Academy of Sciences journal, in which he took about 100 frogs, it may have been 70, and subjected them to atrazine at the levels that EPA considers safe. They were all male frogs. And 70% of those frogs became chemically castrated. 10% of the male frogs turned female and began producing fertile eggs. I've been working on endocrine disruptors, which are a class of chemicals like PCBs that I've been working on for 40 years that affect sexual development. It's not a theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's well documented. So what I said in that case is, I don't know if it's affecting gender dysphoria. I don't know if atrazine is, but isn't it something that we ought to study? Another thing you mentioned is the school shootings. When the Columbine shooting happened, I think 5 families brought lawsuits against the maker of Prozac, which had just been released. But there have been many, many articles since then and a lot of evidence that some of these mass shootings that we're seeing in this country may be related to these new class of drugs, of SSRIs and benzos. Those drugs have a black box warning on them that says they cause homicidal and suicidal behavior. We would take 120 million doses of SSRIs.
That's actually not what it says. It doesn't say they cause homicidal and suicidal behavior. It says they can put people at risk for those behaviors. It doesn't say it causes them. It says it can.
Okay, I thought I qualified it in that way, but you're correct.
Because I am an expert on that, and I am an expert on school shooters, and that is not a factor in that. But my point is not, are you correct or not? And for people who are rolling their eyes when you talk about frogs and then jump, no pun intended, to humans, comparative science is a very valid science, and that's how we get a lot of the discoveries that we do. I'm not taking issue with that at all. My question is, do you have a perception problem because people would form conclusions because on its face it sounds crazy, it sounds like a conspiracy theory? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying, do you have a perception problem?
That question is yes, I do have a perception problem.
And you say I'm putting you in a bad position. I'm trying to clear it up because I see the difference. Like I say, comparative science is a valid thing to consider. And I disagree with some of the things. I think people who say that vaccines today cause autism, I would disagree with that. You're vaccinated, your children are vaccinated, you're talking about mercury accumulation and all, which has really been turned down in vaccines, and there are a lot of ways to get around this. Your position is not that radical. You're not putting people at risk with your position. We have ADD in America. We read headlines and we don't listen to the rest of it. I want to be somebody that stimulates people to say, hey, slow down and don't read the headline, read the story. Find out what he actually says about this before you make a decision. So if it's awkward to hear, it's because I think you have a perception problem, but I think the perception can be corrected if people will just take just a little time to hear what you actually say.
Yeah, and I have a perception problem, particularly in the mainstream media. I do very well, Phil, with kids. I'm beating President Trump and President Biden in Americans under 35 in the battleground states. There's a recent poll that has me beating President Trump and President Biden with Americans under 45 because they're listening to long-form interviews and they're not getting their news exclusively from the mainstream media. So they hear the longer explanation. They actually hear what I'm saying rather than the mischaracterizations of what I supposedly said.
You stand by what you say. You stand by your positions, correct?
Yes.
And you have explanations for them. Agree with it or disagree with it, but hear what I have to say. Don't just judge me because you think, well, that's some kooky theory. You do your homework. And I disagree with some of your conclusions. Some of them I agree with wholeheartedly. But I've taken the time to hear what you have to say. It's informed. You have a basis for what you say. It's all 100% good faith. And I think most people would change their opinion if they would take the time to listen.
Yeah, I think so too.
The mainstream media doesn't cover you the way you want to be covered. I speak to their audience. And that's why I started Meredith Street Media. That's why I do what I do and have as big an audience as I have across all the platforms, because they can get from me what they don't get from the mainstream media. I want to tell them what they don't get about Robert Kennedy Jr. 69% said yes if they made $150,000 a year, were urban dwellers, postgraduates who talked politics on a daily basis. 69% of those that were active in politics said, yeah, it was okay if my candidate had to cheat to win. You could knock me over with a feather. What the hell are people thinking?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I got a lot of those kind of surprises during COVID because I learned how many people were okay with government censoring speech, with government closing down every church in this country, with government closing our schools when we're already having a mental health crisis with our kids.
The people that shut the schools down are the same people that collects data that told them we had the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness among young people since we had started keeping records. And they shut down the school systems, which is where those kids get their stimulation. It's where they learn to interact. It's where they do competition. And it's also where we have mandated reporters who keep their eyes on them and watch for abuse and sexual molestation. Yeah. And instead, we took those eyes off of those kids, sent them home behind closed doors, abandoning them to the very abusers that we were watching for, and referrals for that kind of care dropped to like 50% across the country.
It was the only indicia of social disintegration that actually improved because we stopped counting the abuse.
It just stopped getting reported that much.
Well, it probably got worse.
Of course it did. We abandoned those kids to their abusers, and their answer from Fauci and others was, well, we're doing the best we can with what we know. No, they were not doing the best they can with what they knew. They had no plan to reopen the schools when they closed them down, and they just had a new hammer and everything looked like a nail. And so they just started shutting this business, shutting this school, shutting this, and the teachers' unions were wielding the power.
Well, you know, there was a Brown University study that showed that during those lockdowns, there was a 22% drop in IQ among the youngest Americans. And then CDC, in 2023, revised its milestones. Prior to that, the milestone was that a kid should walk unassisted. That means without touching furniture at 12 months. They now are 18 months. The prior milestone was that children should have 50 words by 24 months, and now that's 30 months. So they're normalizing.
Just keep lowering the standards.
They're normalizing the harm that they did to our children.
And they're doing it in school. 30+% of fifth graders can't read a simple sentence. Almost 30% of eighth graders can't read a most fundamental sentence, and 19% of high school graduates can't read even the instructions on a prescription that they get at the drugstore. How are we continuing to pass these people, Robert? How are you going to fix that?
Well, the education system is a whole other issue. To me, the only way to fix the school system is with charter schools and with school choice. And you need to give the principals more power. And then if that principal is not educating children, the parents get a choice to leave and take their kids somewhere else. We can no longer tell parents, just wait, particularly urban parents who are dealing with these schools that are just... they're criminal enterprises, what we are doing to our kids. They're producing that kind of product. Yeah. If you're failing, there ought to be a market so that somebody has a choice to go somewhere else. And that's the only way that we're going to say rescue these kids. And that needs to be all of our focus. How do we rescue these children?
Do you believe that our educational system is on the brink of catastrophic collapse? Next week on Fill in the Blanks.
These issues are framed today in a way that is calculated to keep us at each other's throats. And it's like the jangling keys. It's BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. They're now trying to buy housing, the residential housing, the agricultural lands. They're jangling the keys over here and say, look at the abortion issue, look at the guns, and look at trans rights. And over here, they're strip mining the wealth from the American middle class.